Welcome to the Family Recovery Conference. My name is Pam Lanhart and I am one of your hosts. And today I'm here with Chris Kelly. Chris is a very close personal friend of mine. Chris has been a mentor for me in really learning and understanding recovery and what recovery is for my family. And I'm going to let Chris introduce herself in a minute, but I just want to say Chris is incredible advocate in the recovery community. She has worked in the recovery field for 5 years, and today we're going to be talking about how to support our loved one when their pathway to recovery might be just a little bit different than what the traditional pathway might look. And so I'm really excited about this because this impacted my family, and what Chris taught me and how she has shown me recovery has impacted how we interact with our own son. So this conversation is really personal to me. So I'm really excited to be here. So Chris, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Chris Kelly, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery. And for me, that means that it's been almost 10 years since I've had the need to use drugs or alcohol. But really what it means is my life is really radically different than it was 10 years ago. So today I show up and I'm a really present mother. I'm engaged with my family. I have a job that I love. I can handle the ups and downs of life. I have a car, and 3 years ago I was able to buy a house. And I really show up for my community wholeheartedly, and I know I have the confidence that I can bring my full self into situations, and I don't have to hide things, and I live on with honesty and integrity in my life. And all that's because of a life in recovery, and it's more so than just abstinence. So it's not about that I removed something from my life, it's that I added a lot of things to my life. And that now I can just, like I said, bring my full self into situations and not try to hide things and know it'll be okay. So to me, that's really what recovery is about, is that you can bring your full self into a situation and love that self, and the people that surround you love that self. And that's, for me, what recovery is really all about.
The people around you love that self, and I just have to testify to that because I get to hang out with her a lot, and I can tell you everybody it's just an honor to be able to walk through this with you and to be part of the recovery community as an ally and an advocate, and to be doing that shoulder to shoulder with someone like you. So I get a little teary-eyed sometimes when I'm with Chris because she's my girl crush. My story, and the reason why I wanted to connect with you on this, is because as a family member, we had a son who was 15 years old, and from the time he was probably 15 till really almost now, but for sure till he was 20 or so, he really resisted the traditional pathway of recovery, and I remember when he was 15 and he went through his first treatment center. That treatment center was pretty heavily 12-step based modality, recovery modality. And so as a family, we really wanted to reinforce that. Like, we really wanted to do everything that the experts told us to do in family recovery. And that was reinforcing this idea that my son was an addict, and that he had to wake up every morning and say he was an addict, and he had to work the 12 steps. And he was incredibly resistant to that, and it caused a ton of conflict in our family. It made things really chaotic and very ugly for a very long period of time, until we started learning a different way. And some of that and most of that education came when I took our Minnesota Peer Recovery Coaching Academy. And I knew that for us, we were learning through other modalities like DBT and CBT and spiritual seeking, and that was helping our family, but I didn't know it was a thing. This is really a thing, that you can find recovery outside of the 12 steps.
Yes.
And then when I met you, which was almost 3 years ago now, you put that really into a beautiful framework for me so that I understood it as a family member. And really, it was, if we want to call it person-centered recovery, I think is what maybe the term that you used.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that first. Multiple pathways to recovery. Like, that's a real thing, right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think part of it is just pointing out that our, we see mainstream medical models really progress. So we see, diabetes care really keep up to date, and we see care for heart disease really keep up to date, meaning there's new medications, new ways to approach it. People are given really a plethora of options when they come in with a condition, and they say, we can work on diet and exercise, and we can work on getting you engaged with things that will get you out walking or exercising, and we can supplement that with this medication, and we're going to look at can your family be supportive to change your diet and cook a different way? And so we see this kind of infusion of support. And I don't know why, but I think our substance use disorder field has kind of lagged behind in that. And I think part of that is the acute care model. So people get just such a short time in treatment. And we know, research shows people need longer in treatment than when our insurance providers currently allow us. And so really, we go through this 30 days of treatment, and that's just the start. I mean, that's just like just a grain of sand in the process. And so I think providers are doing their best, but I also think that, we have a long way to go till we can get people to where they need to be. And so the most prevalent model and what's really readily available are 12-step programs. And so they've been around since about, the 30s, and they work for the people they work for. And so I think there's this misunderstanding that if you say there's multiple pathways, that we're challenging 12 steps, and that's not it. We're just saying there's a whole lot of other pathways out there. So for myself, early in my recovery, or early in my 20s, and I was forced to seek out recovery through legal channels, I was constantly sent to 12-step programs, and I knew it was like trying on a sweater that was made of wool and way too tight. So it just made me itchy, and I couldn't do it, and I tried and I tried and I tried, but it didn't align. And so nothing resonated with me. It just sat on the surface. And so I would go and I would go and I would go, and the messages that I would receive back when I would voice this doesn't feel right was, you're resistant, you don't want it bad enough, or you just haven't hit rock bottom yet. And it was like, well, what is my bottom? If bottom isn't, going to jail, if bottom isn't feeling my body break down, if bottom isn't making choices that I'm ashamed of, I don't want to know bottom. And so, throughout my 20s, I would have kind of stints of abstinence, and sometimes even like dipping my toes in recovery, and then a return to use. And when I finally came into this round of recovery, the last 10 years, I decided to really venture out, because I figured there has to be other people like me, that maybe a 12-step program, it wasn't the right fit. And because I was a little more mature, meaning 35 years old, I had a pretty stable home life, meaning my daughter and I shared an apartment together, so I wasn't coming home to a situation that was like infused with use, so I could have a sober home. And I had a little more confidence in myself to say, I'm going to try to kind of to piece together a recovery pathway that works for me based on things I knew about myself. Like, I knew there was a bit of a spiritual void. And for me, I really found a lot of comfort in like Buddhist teachings and things like mindfulness and meditation and yoga. So I knew that was something I could seek out to kind of fulfill that piece of me. I knew keeping my hands busy was really important. And Pam knows this, but I took on an adventure of baking pies. And so I knew for myself, looking at my recovery, a trouble time was from when I put my daughter to bed till I went to bed. And you know, when you first come into recovery, it's hard to learn how to go to sleep again, something that simple. But you were used to self-medicating, and oftentimes falling asleep wasn't an issue. So coming home, it was like, this is a really difficult time for me, 9 to midnight. And here I am sitting alone. I can't really seek out a meeting or go see people because my daughter's sleeping, so I'm home with her. And so I decided to start cooking and baking pies because it was something I could just put my full self into. And it ended up turning into a whole beautiful adventure of, you know, baking thousands of pies over a year's time because it worked.
Right.
And that was just it. And so...
let me ask you a question about that. And how did you recognize that was a difficult, like, time for you from 9 to 12, or did you have someone that was guiding you or helping you? I think and we'll talk more about this, but one of the things that is so beautiful about AA and NA is that there's a large community. So I think one of the first things people are going to ask you, and especially family members, is, well, if you're not going to AA and NA, where is your support in that? Or how do you even recognize what you need?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So some of that, I'm not a person, I don't thrive in large groups of people. I tend to be the person who feels a little lost. And so being immersed in large groups of people wouldn't be beneficial to me. And I knew that about myself. And so where I find connection is one-to-one relationships. And so really it was about, like, I had started when I came home from treatment the last time. Historically, I'd always worked in restaurants, so I decided to take some time off because that didn't seem like it would be a safe environment for me to jump right back into. And I started working at Whole Foods. And it turned out a woman there that I worked alongside was in recovery from an eating disorder. And the more we talked, there were so many similarities to the challenges we faced. And it kind of is one of the times where it really started making me think, like, oh my gosh, like, this is it's less about what the issue was. It was more about this path I'm on now moving forward. And so we connected on that. So right away at work, I had somebody that I could be open with and talk about my struggles. I also had a partner who was really, really supportive. And so just somebody to love me unconditionally and not put expectations on and not really be prescriptive, but just support is what I was doing because it was all healthy and moving forward. I found a strong community in the yoga community. And so just going to yoga practice, and that was my community of peers. And even though it's a really quiet practice, that's where I healed, was in the company of others. Even though we might not talk, it was in the company of others on this similar spiritual path. And then same with the baking pies. I was alone while I was baking the pies, but I got to give them away. And so that was another way for me to connect and give something back to people, because I knew that was really important to me. And it was like, for me, it was like giving them bits of love. And so again, it might not have been what historically we've looked at as how people might connect, but a lot of that was just, to me, knowing myself. And that the system or the family system and the world I returned to, I had efficacy, like I could determine that. And so that's what was important when I realized there were things like recovery community organizations that taught people about multiple pathways.
That's what, you know what, since you brought that up, I want to ask you if you could, because again, a lot of people really don't even understand the concept or what is multiple pathways and what are some of them. So could you give me some insight on that?
So when we talk about multiple pathways to recovery, really what we're saying, for every person there's a pathway. So even like two individuals in a 12-step program aren't going to be taking the exact same route. It's going to be a little bit different. And so when we talk about multiple pathways, it's more about that say I sit with you and we figure out what are the things that you like to do? What are the things that kind of make your heart feel joyful? And where do you find connection in this world? And so for some people it might be with others in large groups talking about what got them into that space. So that might really align really well with a 12-step program. For others, it might be I don't connect well in large groups, or so I need to have that one-to-one support. And so is it a combination of individualized therapy and then joining a boxing club, or a running club, or
taking an art class.
So it's, I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at it. And so when we say multiple pathways, there isn't even a kind of a prescription for that, because it's really looking at the individual and saying, where do you thrive in life?
Yeah. Well, and if they are more extroverts, I do know there are some other bigger group organizations that might be different than AA or NA. Can you
so there's things like Celebrate Recovery, and so that's going to be a really a faith-based approach. There's Women for Sobriety, that would be really, groups of more, obviously all female groups for people to connect with one another. You can do Health Realization, that's another good spiritual approach. There's Life Ring Recovery. There's Refuge Recovery. And so a Refuge Recovery is a Buddhist approach. There's really countless groups out there. And then there's all recovery meetings as well, and there's that don't really take any particular pathway but invite people from different pathways to come together. But again, I think it's largely, and so those might be groups like you can Google and look up. You can typically, people will find them through looking up like non-12-step support groups. Otherwise, hopefully people can have access to or look up a local recovery community organization. And so there's recovery community organizations across our nation, and really they're a fundamental principle of them is that they support multiple pathways to recovery. And so it's a place someone can walk in and for free start to explore, what are the pathways that I want to be a part of, and what's available to me and what's around. But it's also important not to dismiss that some people will recover in a knitting circle, and some people will recover, like I said, riding bikes with people, or a hiking club, or baking pies or solo. As long as they feel their needs are being met, and that they have a way to explore that. Even online, I've found just different workbooks that you can go through on your own. There's a Hip Sobriety is a whole program online that you can just take and connect with people. You do worksheets, and so it's really a formal way that you can progress through your own recovery. Maybe if you were in a situation like mine, a single mom, you're at home, you have a young child, and you can't leave and go to meetings. And I can tell you the last thing in the world I wanted to do when I came home from treatment was leave my 6-year-old even to go to a meeting. I wanted to suck up every moment that I had with her. And so I really dedicated my life to being a parent, rededicated my life to that. So it's like finding what works for the individual is so important. And it was the first time I thrived in my recovery. So I can say wholeheartedly that works, because I connected to it and it was mine.
Well, what I love is thinking about my own son, who was young and probably really oppositional, like giving him alternatives and saying, well, here are some things that you could do. Why don't you pick, right?
Yeah.
Like, why don't you explore them? and you can figure out what really is good. And at 15 or 16, they probably don't really know as much, but certainly at 21 or 25 or 28, they're going to have a little better idea of who they are. So,
well, and what I think family members can really do is, so you imagine you come home, especially if you had severe substance use, and you come home and there's going to be a little bit of a void coming home, because there's, like you said, well, how did you recognize that 9 to midnight time? Well, I knew that's a time when I would usually partake. And so just timing wise, I knew there'd be a void there. Like, well, what am I going to fill that space with now? And as family members, so we come home from treatment, and treatment's not long enough, and we still have a ton of shame, and we don't know how this system is going to react to us, because now we're changed. And so we come home, and I hear more often than not, it's like you have this void, and you can't really remember what you were good at, and you can't really remember what you like to do. And it might feel different because even your brain chemistry hasn't fully adjusted yet. So what used to give you joy may not give you that joy right away.
right.
So it's great if you can have people around you that help remind you of those things. So even reframing some situations and reminding someone that we used to love to go to movies together. Do you remember when we were little and you'd go to the drive-in? Or, bringing those things back into their memory and helping them see, like, oh, I did used to like to do things without use. And maybe I can try that art class again, or connect with an old friend that I haven't talked to for a long time because they weren't a part of my use. So
what I love too is the languaging that you used around that, and I just want to kind of focus on that really quickly, because I think that, and one of the things we're really trying to do with the Family Recovery Conference is have this conversation about how we can go from a shame-based language approach to a strengths-based approach. So can we just review that again one more time?
Absolutely.
And talk about, I'm the family member and you're the person in recovery. And of course, as family, we want the best for our loved ones, but we don't always really know how to get them to consider, And so you come home and you're with your honey, and you'd kind of forgotten who you were, and there's that conversation that takes place. And from your perspective on that side of recovery, so I'm the family member, you're in recovery, what would be the most beneficial way to frame that conversation with your loved one?
So are you saying like when they first come home? Or
just even, I know what that would look like is, I'm a frustrated family member because my loved one won't listen to me, and they haven't been able to quite discover what is inside of them. And I'm going to want to go, well, you just need to, right? You just need to go take an art class or whatever. So how can we approach that as a family member to really come alongside of them, encourage them, build on their strengths, and what that language might look like?
Well, and I'm sure this response won't surprise you, but first and foremost, we have to model it.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, we have to...
I paid her to say that, so
we have to be
perfect, right?
Engaging in our own healthy behaviors. And so it's not our job as a family member to create an itinerary for our loved one and their daily activities. But if we're staying busy and engaging in our own healthy behaviors, they're more likely to jump on board in their own healthy behaviors because they see us happy and joyful and thriving, and they want that too. Their behaviors may not always display that, but I think that's true especially of younger people. A lot of times they're like, oh, yuck, mom's doing that. But inside there is something like, yeah, I want what she has. And so I think it's really important as loved ones and family members that we are consistently engaging in our own activities and healthy behaviors. We can invite our loved ones with us. And so even if it may be new and awkward, acknowledge that. Oh, do you want to do something crazy and go to yoga with me tonight? You want to try something different? So invite them along and make it okay, make it a safe space.
I want to ask about that because from your perspective, I know sometimes I would think, well, this would not be appropriate for me to do that with my son or whatever.
Yeah.
So, do you feel like you were receptive to the family coming along and doing that together?
Well, mine was a little different because it was the opposite. It was more bringing my daughter in.
Okay.
But things like, so I brought my daughter with me to the 2015 Unite to Face Addiction rally in Washington, D.C. So I took my 9-year-old with me to this rally of 40,000 people in recovery in Washington, D.C. And that was so important to me. So I do think it's appropriate because it's a way of just loving them unconditionally.
Yeah. And bringing the family together, right?
Yeah, and I think it inspires us too. So it maybe going to the yoga class with you doesn't mean they're going to do yoga, but they're like, oh, it's not so scary to be in my body. I bet I can go to the gym, or I bet I can go for a bike ride, or it might inspire other things. And in encouragement. So it's not so much about telling people what to do, but encouraging them. And again, we take that strengths-based approach. Like, maybe if there is an old bike, go out and get it fixed up for them. Yeah. That's a way you could encourage someone to say, hey, this is available to you if you want,
So that leads me into having this conversation about Recovery Capital and the 8 dimensions of wellness. And then also what you talked about is what Recovery Capital looks like for you, but then also what that might look like for the family, right? Because when we talk about modeling recovery, I think we always, as a family member, think that they have to do recovery.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you say is we have to do recovery. Yeah. So talk about Recovery Capital, and then if you can kind of identify maybe even some ways that as a family member we can build our Recovery Capital as well, that would be great.
Yeah. So I don't know if it'll be talked about in other parts of the conference, but Recovery Capital is an idea of, I compare it to financial capital. So we all know if you are going to make a large purchase, you typically know your credit score, how much money you have in the bank, you bring your checkbook with you. We're very, very familiar as a society with that. So Recovery Capital really expands that to other dimensions of our life. So you can have occupational capital and relational capital and spiritual capital, educational capital. And so you have all these different areas of life. And the idea is that they're your internal and your external resources capital in your life. And so if you need to make a withdrawal, you have to have reserves in there. And so in a relationship, if I'm only making withdrawals in this relationship, pretty soon you're going to be empty. You're going to have nothing left to give me. So I have to make deposits in our relationship. So I think even as a family, talking about that and being really upfront and saying, hey, look, we're a family unit. Let's look at ways, where do we have capital in our family? We eat dinner together every night. We watch a movie once a week. We go for a walk. How about we make eye contact when we're talking? How about we tell each other one thing about each other that we're grateful for every day? I mean, there's a million different ways a family can build capital within that family unit. And it's you can agree upon different things. And did that answer it? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So facilitating that conversation.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about, so again, my loved one's coming home and I want to sit down and I don't want to sound like I'm being pushy or, telling them what to do. And so, what would be a way that we can kind of, because honestly, I don't even know that a lot of treatment centers really talk about recovery in this way. This is really foreign and almost revolutionary, right? To a lot of people.
Well, and so I think putting it on the table that it's going to be different, like acknowledging that. And so telling our loved one, we always want to validate how they're feeling. And so, which can be hard, so it's going to take a lot. So hopefully the time that they're, if they go away to something like a residential treatment, or they're not in the home, that we're doing our own work so we feel secure. And that doesn't mean that every single thing has to be forgotten. You know, we can forgive, but we don't have to forget it. But we do want to find healthy ways to have those conversations. And so when they come home, I think it's important to validate, like, wow, that was probably really scary what you went through. And you're this is probably really scary right now because we haven't had an opportunity to have a relationship where we're both sober and we're both here to have an honest conversation. And this is new. Like, when's the last time we were able to do this? And so I think just putting that out there versus, I think sometimes I've heard families say, like, they just tried to act like everything was normal, which is really difficult for a loved one because the last thing they feel walking through that door is normal. And what was normal, too. So we always have to be careful when we say normal, because what is their version of normal?
Well, in normal, prior to recovery, could have been very not healthy either. And so I think that's why this conversation is so important too. And what you said just resonates with me, which is, you know, looking at our recovery capital as family. And this is why I wanted to really have you kind of talk about that a little bit, is that whatever we're asking someone who is working on their sobriety to do, we really should be doing ourselves. And I just want to, you said that, and I want to highlight that again. And so it's not a they and us. It's not, you know, it's a we. And so building that recovery capital so that when they come home.
So they're coming home to this, at least people who are searching to improve the quality of the family, the relationships, the life. So it's all very uplifting. Again, because if we come home to normal, what was normal might be actually a step back for us. But I think too, having open, honest conversations, and the more you ask your loved one for input into what that might look like, that creates a sense of ownership. And so it's okay to have, I mean, you know, I promote having boundaries. Boundaries are awesome and healthy. The loved one can have boundaries too. Like, you know, I prefer that you knock when you're coming in my room, because that might not have been the norm before they came into recovery. That we don't assume the worst. So always set the expectation that a full recovery is what is there and available, and that's what we're going for. So we don't want to set up situations that feel like I'm just waiting for you to fail.
Can you say that again?
We don't.
Because I think that is so important. Right?
So I think one of the best things families can do is not set up situations that feel like we're just waiting for you to fail.
Right.
Because we hear that in the language and the slogans of like, oh, relapse is a part of recovery. And a lot of the work I do is reframing the language around that's not true and that's not accurate. And so relapse is a part of addiction. Relapse is a part of an illness and a disease, but it's not a part of recovery. And so I think being family members, if we set the expectation and the belief system towards you can recover, and I know this is possible, and I believe in you, and I'm going to love you unconditionally. And I've shared with Pam, I love that, like, you can tell our kids, I love you the most. What you do will not make me love you more, and what you do will not make me love you less. And so I think creating a home that has that, in a relationship with, even if it's an adult child, a relationship with an adult child that's based upon that non-negotiable, I love you the most. And so your behaviors are really inconsequential to that love.
Right.
So
Right.
what we have to do is renegotiate how we behave with each other. And that's going to take some change, and acknowledge that to your loved one. Like, that means I need to change too. What is it helpful? What can I do that's most helpful for helping you stay healthy?
And you know what? One of the things that I love is this little trick that is reframing a statement into a question.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So instead of saying, you know, you should do this,
Yes.
or why don't you go do this?
Yes.
You're saying, you're reframing that as a question, like, what could you do? Or
Yeah.
how could I support you in this? Or,
Yes.
you know, what does this look like for you?
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
it's not about us. Our recovery
Yeah.
is our responsibility.
Yep.
And I think that families do have to work on it,
Mm-hmm.
their recovery. And then having those conversations. And I think in our family, that was probably the hardest thing, was learning how to communicate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have a lifetime of experience behaving one way, right? And not just our loved one who had the substance use disorder, but us. As humans on this earth, we get very comfortable with our behaviors. And so I would suggest too, like, what comes up? Like, get to know yourself and what comes up. Do you get that kind of prickly, heated sensation when it's like, why should I have to change when it's their problem? Like, take that question somewhere and hash it out with somebody. Break it apart and look at it. Like, what's inside of there? Because there's probably a lot of stuff inside of you that's with that question. And if we really want to create a space for our loved ones to kind of take off in their recovery and grow and heal and change and then be a part of our family system, I think we have to do that with ourselves, is look at those things.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that, because that is, I think that's our responsibility as family members, is to dig in the same way that we're asking, you know. Our
And it may
lives.
not always feel fair, and I
No.
can understand that, but there's a lot of things that don't feel very fair in this life, and for a lot of times, you know, I help when I'm speaking to groups, I often reframe things to, if this was a different illness, how would you feel about it? And I think we have to keep, it's not to make people feel bad or to shame them, but just to add that light that if this was cancer, if this was heart disease, how do you think your feelings towards it might be different? And we say that because we know the person is not choosing to have an addiction. We don't choose that. We didn't write it in our script. And it's important that when they're trying to get well, again, we say, well, what would I offer them?
Yeah. You know, before we run out of time, I want to ask you a little bit about recovery coaching or peer coaching, because that's one way that we can potentially support them, helping identify what their needs and wants are.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a new concept. Not everybody knows about recovery coaching. Some people are still kind of skeptical about whether it works. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I had the honor of facilitating Recovery Coach Academy at Minnesota Recovery Connection when I worked there. And so really recovery coaching is a person with lived experience in addiction and recovery goes through some sort of training. And so nationwide, every state has its own training, it's their own certification boards. So it's I feel like it's an approach you can trust, because so you can look at someone's credentials and know if they have done some sort of training and have some sort of fidelity to the coaching model, which I always suggest. So, because anybody can take any title, so you always want to validate that somebody has some background or history in coaching. But so people with lived experience go through a training. And that training really helps them identify how to use their story in helping others, connecting with and helping others. And really it's about teaching people to do that strengths-based approach. So you meet with somebody together. You can make it as formal or informal as you want. So depending where you're working in. So if you're working in a treatment facility, it might be more formal, in the community be less. But in working with somebody, I do what I kind of described earlier, is through conversation, I'm going to start to help you realize your own strengths and things that you can connect to, have connected to in the past, maybe long ago, that help you, that really make you feel more alive. And then things that you want to be doing that you know are going to improve the quality of your life. And then together we walk down that path together. And so I help you create goals. I help you break those into smaller pieces so that you can obtain those goals. And then we work together towards them. So coaches often, I help break down barriers as a coach. And I help advocate with you. Sometimes I advocate for you, and sometimes I help people advocate for themselves. And find out that because there's so much shame and stigma in our system, a lot of times people don't get the level of care that they deserve. So we work on ways to help make that happen and hold systems accountable so that people are getting the appropriate level of care. But a coach is really that that guide by the side. So it's a non-prescriptive model. I'm here to help you figure out your pathway, and we explore that together. It's a journey, and then walk with you down that pathway just so you don't feel alone. And when you have questions, there's someone to ask that. I'm your advocate and someone who stands by your side, but I'm not your family member. And Pam knows I often advocate that family members are able to return to their role as mother, father, sister, partner, and not try to be the counselor and the caseworker and the therapist
and the probation officer.
You've
got to do a UH, right?
So that we, come back to
we can
the
just
roles
be mom or
that we were meant to be, because that person we love needs all those roles. So I strongly advocate that people look for their local recovery community organization, because that's a great place to find coaches, and they'd be able to, if they don't have them at the facility, they might be able to tell you where somebody can connect with a coach. But over the coming years, we're going to see more and more and more of this.
Well, we were just talking earlier that there's actually some apps now, right?
Yes.
That people can plug into, and we can do it as family, or mostly they're geared towards people in sobriety, but they're awesome. Do you?
Yeah. So Recovery is a great app that's...
and it's spelled RECOVREE.
Correct.
Recovery.
Yes.
Without an E in there. So when you're looking for it, and it's like, it almost looks like purple and white. It looks like white paw prints almost on a purple background.
And so the founders, Luke and Melissa, had come to Minnesota Recovery Connection years ago when they were really forming this app. And they're a brother and sister duo. Luke's in long-term recovery and his sister is his advocate. And they saw this gap in the system that connecting to a coach was really hard because it's an emerging workforce. And so they developed this app that anyone can sign up for, and on the other end, they get connected to a coach. And they really took their time when developing it to use a recovery capital model to look at that strengths-based approach. They're looking at things in the app. So as an end user, I'm inputting everything that I want that coach to know. And so we're looking at, how did you sleep? How did you eat? There's opportunities for journaling. There's opportunities to increase your physical exercise. Really, the user determines what that looks like. So it's a way that we're starting to individualize and tailor recovery, just like we do with other diseases, that we're looking at what do you need to be successful in your recovery, and then creating a system where it connects to that person who can help you maintain that system that you've chosen.
One of the things I really love about that too is that it's accessible nationally regardless of location.
Yeah.
Because I know that there are, part of the reasons why the Family Recovery Conference is so beneficial is because people can access it, right? No matter what community they live in or what resources are available in that community.
Yeah, well, and there's just, there again, we're on our phones a lot, so they found a great system to help somebody plug in. And then never there are lots of different Facebook groups and things that someone initiating recovery or coming into recovery can explore. So a way to connect online where they can connect with other people in recovery and just start to build that community, even if at first it's a virtual community. That's okay, because it might lead them to in-person connections.
Which one of the recovery pathways we didn't talk about, and they have a lot of Smart Recovery.
Yes.
Has a lot of virtual groups, and that's kind of CBT informed.
Yep.
And so for people who really like maybe
Worksheets
more
and
of that
concrete.
therapeutic
Yes.
type, work,
Yes.
pros and cons,
Yeah.
cost analysis and things like
Yeah.
that, like that Smart Recovery. And they have Smart Recovery Friends and Family too, which is
Yep.
kind of neat because then you can do it together.
Yeah.
So, and I really like the idea of the one where you talked about that they have a workbook that you go through.
Yeah, the hip sobriety.
Hip sobriety.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking to myself, now could a family member kind of go through that at the same time? And maybe,
I would think a lot of the things outside of kind of what we see as traditional recovery pathways, I feel are really adaptable to family members. And at points in my recovery, and I think we've talked about this, and I'm like, being in recovery is my biggest blessing because I had the opportunity to really look at my life under a microscope. So I would not change it for anything because now of the person I am and the strength I have and the voice I have and how well I know myself, I think sometimes we can live a pretty, kind of easy life and never have those challenges. So I just think it's important to know too that there is a point where people can be really proud of what they went through because it gave them the strength to go on and help others. Yeah.
And before we wrap up here, I just want to go back to because you said, and I'll probably get a little choked up here, your honey, and you met before you were in recovery.
Yeah.
And you're still together.
Yeah.
Right? You're still together.
Yeah. 10 years later.
I think there's so much hope right there
Yeah.
because I think a lot of people get this message that we have to detach from those relationships and we have to separate ourselves because that's what, real boundaries are, right? It's just not being in that relationship at all. And so I just want to wrap up by just maybe, this is a very spontaneous question, we didn't talk about this, but what do you think was the most instrumental piece of that relationship as far as what did your honey do prior to you getting help and then in that early recovery that made it possible for you guys to stay together? Right? Like I always tell people, especially the partner, there's a lot of women that come into our groups and people have kind of been like, well, you need to just separate or divorce and I'm like, if they didn't really love their honey, they wouldn't be looking for help, right? So like acknowledging, like, we know you love them. So just maybe just one thing or a couple things that he did really well in that.
Well, I think this too, but he loved me unconditionally. There was never an ultimatum. It was never if you don't do this or you do this, that philosophy of I'll love you more or I'll love you less. And early in my recovery, it was just he continuously pointed out like it was like a light was coming on. And so it was always just these really tender moments of letting me know, like, oh yeah. And he, it's because in my youth I would say, like, I don't understand why you're with me. Why would you be with me? This is like, you could go on and have somebody else and I'm so broken, and this language I used. And he just kept reaffirming, like, I see something in you. I see something in you. I know, like, you're in there. And so it wasn't dismissing and saying, no, you're fine. And it wasn't, just kind of sugarcoating and that sort of thing. And it also wasn't coming at me and saying, yeah, you're right, you're terrible, you're horrible. You're a broken person. Get your stuff together. It wasn't either end. It was that strengths-based thing of seeing, yep, the situation we're in is not good, but you are separate from the situation. So like fundamentally, that my spiritual, that piece of me, my soul was not the broken person that my shell was. And so having him reaffirm that consistently and continue to love me, I do believe, and my family members were that way too, is like that's my thread that brought me into recovery and helped me come into recovery.
Yeah. I remember you telling me about your dad.
Yeah. Yeah, and so he just, and he was with me for my entire addiction career. And so when it was time to stop, when I just really was so sick and so tired, I just called and said, Dad, I'm done. And he knew what that meant. And he just drove over to my apartment in South Minneapolis and sat with me, and he just said, what do you need me to do? And it wasn't about enabling, because I just said, I was like, go through the house, get this out, and came back and sat down, and he just kept holding my hand, and it was his presence of being there and letting me guide and unravel that kind of mess I was in, and just being with me through that process gave me the strength to go through that process.
That line that you just said, he was with you, right? He didn't do it for you, but they both, the common denominator with your honey and with your dad was that they were with you.
Yeah.
And I think that just is a great way to finish this up,
Yeah.
is that if there's one way we can support our loved ones with any recovery pathway, it's letting them know, right?
Yeah.
That we're with
them.
Yeah.
Thanks. You're welcome. Aw.
Thank you for joining us, Chris. And
thank you for
this.
having me.
And,
Thank you.
And we will, if Chris lets us, we'll put some of her information on the website.
Absolutely.
We'll make sure that we connect all those resources that we talked about some of the different pathways. And most importantly, as family members, start your recovery today, whether they're still in active addiction or if they're in early recovery. We can really model and build our own recovery capital.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.